Prophecy trap. Fans theorized that the Bene Gesserit's Lisan al-Gaib prophecy was entirely manufactured manipulation, and both book and film confirm this was exactly the Sisterhood's master plan. The Missionaria Protectiva is a 10,000-year Bene Gesserit program designed to implant false religions and prophecies on primitive worlds as tools of manipulation. For centuries, the Sisterhood tailored Fremen religion specifically, planting the concept of a male messiah called the Lisan al-Gaib, which translates to voice from the outer world. This prophecy was meant to provide a psychological escape route for any Bene Gesserit stranded on Arrakis, by giving them a manipulative lever over the Fremen population. The Bene Gesserit never believed an actual male Kwisatz Haderach would emerge naturally, as they had engineered the breeding program over 10,000 years to create one under their control. Paul, an unforeseen variable due to Jessica's disobedience in having a son instead of a daughter, paradoxically fulfills this fake prophecy anyway. Frank Herbert explicitly stated that the prophecy itself is false in construction, planted deliberately, yet Paul makes it come true through his actions regardless. The Dune films emphasize this manipulation, showing how carefully the Bene Gesserit orchestrated religions across the Imperium. This theory demonstrates Frank Herbert's central theme about how organizations create their own downfall through manipulation. The Bene Gesserit spent 10,000 years engineering a controllable messiah, only to have their own planted prophecy spiral into an uncontrollable religious jihad that kills billions. It's the ultimate irony, as they created the very thing they feared. Reluctant villainy. Theories that Paul Atreides isn't a hero, but rather a tragic villain, were confirmed by Frank Herbert himself, who explicitly stated the character was designed as a warning, not an inspiration. Frank Herbert stated in 1979 that the bottom line of the Dune trilogy is to beware of heroes, and that it's much better to rely on your own judgment and your own mistakes. In 1985, Herbert clarified that Dune was aimed at this whole idea of the infallible leader because his view of history says that mistakes made by a leader or made in a leader's name are amplified by the numbers who follow without question. Paul is constructed to show how charismatic leaders manipulate religion for personal power, using the word jihad to illustrate religious extremism. The character demonstrates Herbert's fear of prescient individuals with absolute power, as even with foresight, Paul cannot prevent the religious war that kills 61 billion people in his name. Denis Villeneuve's 2024 film adaptation doubles down on this interpretation, never depicting Paul's rise as heroic, but rather as increasingly sinister and morally bankrupt. Paul's final scene in Dune Part 2 shows him as a changed man, transformed by spice addiction and prescient visions into someone capable of betraying his closest ally. The films deliberately avoid crowd-pleasing triumph moments, instead emphasizing bone-chilling horror at Paul's transformation into a tyrant. This is perhaps the most important theory about the entire saga, as audiences were meant to watch Paul's rise with dread, not excitement. The theory reshapes how viewers understand 6 books of dense narrative, revealing that everything is building toward a cautionary tale about blind faith in leadership. This wasn't a subtle theme, as Herbert made it explicit in interviews. Jessica's disobedience. Fan theories about why the Bene Gesserit allowed Jessica to have a son when their 10,000-year plan required a daughter were answered, as they couldn't force her without destroying the entire breeding program. The Bene Gesserit plan specifically called for Jessica to bear a daughter, not a son, who would then marry a Harkonnen male to unite the bloodlines. Jessica's pregnancy was supposed to end with a female child coded through prana bindu training to control the child's sex. Jessica deliberately chose to have a son, Paul, instead, directly violating the Sisterhood's orders. The Bene Gesserit couldn't force a second daughter without risk, as the cost of coercion was too high. Jessica's loyalty to Leto and her protective instincts would make her unpredictable and dangerous to their plans. Threatening the Duke himself was dangerous because he was deeply in love with Jessica and would defend her unconditionally. The Sisterhood's inability to control Jessica revealed a fundamental flaw in their 10,000-year plan, as they couldn't guarantee outcomes once emotions entered the equation. This theory shows how even the most powerful organizations with millennia of planning can be undone by a single person choosing love over duty. Jessica's disobedience cascades into consequences the Sisterhood could never have predicted. Genetic engineering. Fans theorized that Feyd-Rautha wasn't just the Baron's nephew, but rather a carefully bred genetic experiment designed by the Bene Gesserit as a backup plan to produce the Kwisatz Haderach. When Jessica gave birth to Paul instead of a daughter, the Bene Gesserit's breeding plan collapsed, as a female Atreides child was supposed to marry Feyd-Rautha to create the prophesied Kwisatz Haderach. The Sisterhood immediately dispatched Margot Fenring, a secret Bene Gesserit agent, to seduce Feyd-Rautha and conceive his biological child, preserving his genetics for future breeding schemes. Fade's genetic makeup was specifically chosen because he possessed important genotypes on the Harkonnen Y chromosome needed to combine with Atreides' bloodlines. Margot was instructed to implant a fail-safe word of command in Fade's mind that could render him physically paralyzed on command, creating a safety mechanism if he became a threat. Paul was later offered this paralysis word to use against Fade during their final duel, but refused it, choosing to defeat his rival on equal terms. Fade represented the Bene Gesserit's contingency plan, as if Paul failed their tests, they still had a genetically superior Harkonnen heir they could manipulate into following the Sisterhood's agenda. This theory reveals that even the Bene Gesserit's great rival, House Harkonnen, was partially under the Sisterhood's control through selective breeding. It shows the sheer scope of their manipulation, as they had backup plans to their backup plans. The Sisterhood was preserving a second Kwisatz Haderach without the Harkonnens even fully understanding it, demonstrating the difference between the Baron's plans within plans and the Bene Gesserit's actual centuries-spanning strategies. Fatal jealousy. Theories that Emperor Shaddam Carino IV orchestrated the destruction of House Atreides not because of the Harkonnen feud, but because Duke Leto's popularity threatened his throne, are explicitly confirmed in the novels and films. Duke Leto Atreides was gaining significant power and support within the Landsraad, positioning himself as an unofficial spokesman for the great houses. The Emperor viewed Leto's rising popularity as an existential threat to his authority and absolute power. The Baron's logic captures the Emperor's mindset. When is a gift not a gift? The Atreides' voice is rising, and the Emperor is a jealous man. A dangerous, jealous man. A sentiment expressed in Denis Villeneuve's film adaptation. Shaddam IV created the trap of ordering House Atreides to Arrakis specifically to isolate them from their homeworld, Caladan, where they had massive local support and superior defenses. The Emperor provided his personal Sardaukar military force to ensure the Harkonnen succeeded. An unprecedented intervention, proving this wasn't a simple house feud. The Emperor's plan backfired catastrophically because he failed to account for the Bene Gesserit factor, as Jessica and Paul survived when he expected both to be eliminated. Fans theorized the Emperor was more than just a distant figurehead, as he was actively orchestrating the chess game. The payoff reveals that his paranoia creates his own worst enemy, when Paul survives and eventually takes his throne. The theory demonstrates how those seeking absolute control often engineer their own downfall. Unreliable prescience. Fan theories that Paul's prescient visions weren't guaranteed prophecies, but rather probabilistic predictions that changed the moment he acted on them were confirmed throughout the books, and perfectly illustrated in the films. Frank Herbert explicitly writes in Dune that the prescience, he realized, was an illumination that incorporated the limits of what it revealed, at once a source of accuracy and meaningful error. Prescience operates on a Heisenberg uncertainty principle, as the expenditure of energy required to see the future changes what he sees. Paul frequently states that his visions show possible futures, not guaranteed outcomes, meaning the future remains in flux until he takes action. Two prescient beings, like Paul and another Foreseer, create quantum uncertainty around each other, because their visions interfere with each other's probability calculations. Paul's inability to prevent his own jihad isn't because he's weak, but because his prescience shows him only probabilistic outcomes, and preventing the jihad requires actions that create even worse futures. Herbert explicitly designed this limitation as a warning, revealing that even with near-perfect foresight, leaders cannot control complex outcomes, because prediction itself alters the system. Denis Villeneuve's films show Paul progressively losing control of events, proving that prescience doesn't equal control. This theory reframes prescience from a superpower into a curse, as Paul sees many possible futures but cannot lock onto a single, guaranteed path. It's the perfect metaphor for Herbert's larger theme, demonstrating that leaders with perfect information still cannot perfectly control outcomes. Alia's abomination. Theories that Alia Atreides' later possession by the Baron Harkonnen was scientifically inevitable, not a random tragedy, were proven when Herbert explained the danger of preborn Reverend Mothers accessing ancestral memories without a mature personality. In Dune, there's a critical taboo stating that a pregnant Bene Gesserit must never consume the water of life, because the unborn child becomes preborn, gaining ancestral memories before developing an independent consciousness. Jessica unknowingly undergoes the spice agony while pregnant with Alia, making Alia the first female preborn with full access to Reverend Mother consciousness. Preborn children lack the psychological maturity and ego strength to resist possession by dominant ancestral personalities. Alia's specific tragedy involves the Baron Harkonnen's personality in her ancestral memory being unusually strong and invasive, making her especially vulnerable to possession. The Bene Gesserit's fear wasn't superstition, but hard-won knowledge from millennia of experience with uncontrolled preborn. What seemed like tragic misfortune in Book 1 is revealed to be scientific inevitability, as Jessica's choice to undergo the spice agony while pregnant didn't just break a rule, it created a ticking psychological time bomb. Jessica's disobedience had consequences far beyond the breeding plan, as her defiance created the very abomination the Bene Gesserit feared most. By the way, if this is the kind of content you're into, I create videos like this regularly. I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Betrayal wasn't romantic. Fans theorized that Chani's departure at the end of Dune Part 2 wasn't a tragic love story ending, but rather her recognition that Paul had become the very thing they both claimed to oppose, a manipulative, Imperial power broker. Throughout Dune Part 2, Paul explicitly tells Chani that he doesn't want power, he's not the Mahdi, and he just wants to fight beside her. Chani believes Paul is different from other leaders until the final act, when he declares his intent to marry Princess Irulan as a strategic move to claim the Imperial throne. Paul's decision represents a double betrayal, as he lied about his ambitions, and he publicly humiliates Chani by choosing another woman purely for political calculation. Chani's anger is justified and intellectual, not emotional, because Paul is using the exact Bene Gesserit manipulation tactics he claimed to reject. In the novels, Paul tells Chani his marriage to Irulan is purely political, and she accepts it. In Villeneuve's adaptation, Paul withholds this information, making him deceptive. Chani leaving on a sandworm represents her rejection of the false prophecy and her recognition that Paul has become Muad'Dib, the messianic tyrant, not the freedom fighter. This is explicitly set up as the catalyst for Dune Messiah's plot, where the Bene Gesserit conspire to remove Paul from power, and Chani may eventually oppose him. Chani's departure isn't a heartbreak scene, but rather the moment the last decent character recognizes that Paul is lost to power. She becomes the true moral center of the story because she's willing to walk away when ideals are compromised. Villeneuve deliberately made Chani more independent and morally aware than in the novels, as her leaving is a statement that she won't support tyranny, even when it comes from someone she loves. Bene Gesserit conspiracy. Theories that the Bene Gesserit would actively plot against Paul once they realized he'd escaped their control were confirmed in Dune Messiah, where the Sisterhood orchestrates a conspiracy involving multiple factions to remove him. The Bene Gesserit quickly realized that Jessica's training of Paul in their ways, combined with his mentat abilities from his father's training, made him immune to their standard control mechanisms. In Dune Messiah, the Sisterhood coordinates with the Tleilaxu, the Spacing Guild, and Princess Irulan to engineer Paul's downfall. The conspiracy's goal is to either eliminate Paul or force him to renounce prescience, allowing them to restart the Kwisatz Haderach breeding program with a version they can actually control. Count Fenring, nearly a successful Kwisatz Haderach himself, is considered as an alternative but lacks Paul's prescience and power. The theory confirms Herbert's warning about institutions, as the Bene Gesserit created their own enemy and then had to conspire against him rather than admit they'd lost control of their own prophecy. This sets up the premise for the later books and shows how the first book's ending, which seemed triumphant, actually sows the seeds for ongoing conflict. Thufir's choice. Fans theorize that Thufir Hawat's death scene at the end of Dune wasn't an accident or defeat, but rather a final act of loyalty, a conscious choice to remove himself as a potential weapon the Harkonnen could use against Paul. Thufir was captured and poisoned by the Baron, forced to take daily antidotes to stay alive, creating the ultimate control mechanism over a mentat. Thufir is manipulated into believing Jessica betrayed Duke Leto, making him willing to work against Paul initially. When Thufir discovers the truth, that Jessica was loyal and Paul is the legitimate heir, his mentat logic leads him to realize he's too compromised to serve reliably. Rather than become a potential liability or a pawn the Harkonnen could activate against Paul, Thufir chooses death rather than harm his duke. He deliberately removes his own heart plug, prioritizing loyalty over survival in what might be called an honorable act. Thufir's death is the opposite of Paul's descent. As where Paul compromises principles for power, Thufir chooses principles over power. It's the counterpoint to Paul's moral bankruptcy, demonstrating that even secondary characters in Herbert's work embody philosophical themes about choice and consequence. Living factories. Theories about the sandworm life cycle producing spice weren't just speculation, as they're confirmed hard science within Dune's universe, making the entire economy dependent on a delicate biological system. Sandworms exist in multiple life stages, including sand plankton, which is microscopic, sand trout, which are larvae, and adult sandworms. Spice, or melange, is literally a waste byproduct of sandworm biology, consisting of a mixture of sand trout excretions and organic compounds that ferment and explode to the surface as spice blow. Sand trout create underground membranes that capture water, which is toxic to their grown form, essentially terraforming Arrakis to keep it dry for themselves. When water mixes with sand trout excretions, it creates a fungusoid wild growth that becomes the pre-spice mass. Without sandworms, there is no spice, and without spice, the entire empire collapses, as it's the biological foundation of galactic civilization. What seemed like mystical ecology is hard science, revealing that the entire Imperium is dependent on managing the life cycle of a single organism. This is why terraforming Arrakis and killing the worms would be civilization-altering, as Paul's terraforming plans in Dune Messiah and God Emperor of Dune represent him essentially planning to fundamentally restructure galactic civilization by eliminating the spice source. Protocol breach. Fans theorized that Jessica's decision to train Paul in Bene Gesserit ways, which she was explicitly forbidden from doing, was the single most consequential act that destroyed the Bene Gesserit's entire 10,000-year plan. Jessica was ordered to have a daughter, and if she had to have a son, she was absolutely forbidden from training him in Bene Gesserit techniques. Jessica trained Paul in mental disciplines, combat, and prescience anyway, directly violating her oath to the sisterhood. This training made Paul immune to standard Bene Gesserit control mechanisms and allowed him to survive the Gom Jabbar test. Paul combined Bene Gesserit abilities with Mentat abilities, creating something the sisterhood couldn't have predicted or controlled. A single mother's love, her determination to protect her son with every tool she possessed, cascaded into the downfall of a galactic sisterhood. It's Herbert's most human counterpoint to grand conspiracies, as first she has the wrong child, then she trains him wrong, and both choices compound the sisterhood's loss of control. Eunuch limitation. A throwaway revelation that Count Fenring was nearly a successful Kwisatz Haderach, but couldn't reproduce, was explained as a genetic limitation, proving the Bene Gesserit's breeding program required both prescience and biological viability. Count Fenring has almost all Kwisatz Haderach abilities, including prescience, combat skills, and Mentat abilities, but is sterile, functionally a eunuch. The Bene Gesserit discovered that the Kwisatz Haderach required both prescience and reproductive capability to fulfill the breeding program. Fenring remained relevant to Imperial politics, but could never be the ultimate weapon the sisterhood sought. Paul's superiority wasn't just prescience, but rather prescience combined with the ability to father the next generation. This theory reveals that the perfect man still wasn't perfect without reproductive capability, as the Bene Gesserit's obsession with bloodlines wasn't spiritual, it was biological calculation. This illustrates the systematic nature of the Bene Gesserit's work, showing that every detail of the program was calculated across generations. If you found this valuable, subscribe so you never miss new content. Appreciate you watching.